Hello and welcome to another episode of Hydra's Den. I'm your host Hydra, and today I'm joined by co-host Owlbear. Say hello.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello.
So, for those who are joining us for the first time, this is a D&D, well, any sort of tabletop game really. Help stream. We go over a variety of topics here. I'll be joined by a bunch of different people, and we generally try to hash things out in a way that new DMs will be able to pick it up and use it when they make their own stuff. We both have quite a few years of tabletop under our belts, so I should hope we have a bit of experience on this. Anything you want to add to start?
Oh, no, I think we should just dive right into it.
Okay, so today we are covering a question from the Discord. That in mind, if you want to ask your own questions or talk with us, the best way is to contact us on the Discord. Link to that will be in the description if you're looking at this on YouTube. So this one comes from Spaceman, and he kind of gave us. I kind of had to get a bit more of a concrete question out of him because he was not sure how to exactly phrase it, but basically what he wanted to ask is, how do you make a story with while working with the players without making the players feel like they're being forced into it? How do you make sure that the players can discover your story instead of being railroaded into it? This is something we've actually covered in several different streams to some extent. There was one a while back where we directly covered how to make your first campaign through all the details. It was a bit on the rougher side, so today I'm hoping we can get a bit more in depth on the specific interaction between DMs and players. This is something I'm sure you have some experience yourself in.
Yeah, especially over when you're merging friend groups, or if you're playing with people you don't know a lot. Trying to write with them in mind and keeping everybody engaged is kind of like juggling flaming axes.
Yeah, that's one way of saying it. I'd say the most important thing when we're diving into this is going to be to kind of nail down a very important point, which is what kind of group of players are you working with. I've talked about this before, but there are some players who you can start a story with, and they will follow every lead you put out. They will relentlessly take notes on everything you do, and man, oh man, those are fantastic players to work with. But there are other players that if you put them in a tavern with a mysterious man who's supposed to give them their quest and a bearded gnome, they will jump after the bearded gnome every time. Sure, it's always a pain to deal with, but that's the way it goes. So what? Oh,
I was gonna say it's like herding cats trying to hook the players initially. Like the first major hook is really the hardest one to set, from my experience.
exactly. So when I would look at this, I actually view this in kind of two ways from my experience. There's two sort of paths you can follow when you're getting into this. Most new DMs, you're gonna probably want to go down one of these routes. So the first route is and the two routes follow this kind of question. And this question is, are you going to build your story off of what the players do, or are you going to get the players to follow your story? So this is probably the most important question to ask at the beginning when you're doing this kind of writing. It's the type of thing that a lot of people worry about because this gets into the infamous line of railroading. So for those who don't know what railroading is the idea that you are forcing your players to follow how you want things to go, and you're removing their free agency. It's something that
It's having a very linear story where you don't offer or don't allow sidetracking off of what primarily needs to be done, and this is often done in a story by enforced time limits, like you have until this time to do this or else Y will happen.
Yeah.
And that's normally how they keep people on the track that are at least interested in the story.
I would argue that's the better way to do it, but I've seen much worse where I've seen it where you try to interact with the character who's the DM hasn't worked with, and the DM just shuts you down.
Yeah, I've experienced that.
Yeah.
They'll introduce NPCs they don't expect you to get hooked on, and they're unable to kind of think fast enough on the fly to kind of get you back into line, and they'll just shut you down abruptly, and that can really ruin a lot of sessions and a lot of roleplay time.
Yeah.
When the DM just kind of pulls the collar back and you're forced into your seat.
Yeah, I've actually had it as bad as trying to be creative in solving a scenario and have the DM just go, "Come on, are you really going to do that?" And then just, well, I mean, what do you say to that? You know, it's not. It kind of ruins a lot of the sort of feeling of freedom. Yeah, the immersion and the feeling of freedom that you're supposed to get out of this. So I'm going to say right now, for these two paths of going about writing, taking the path of letting the players lead the story should only be done if you are good at thinking on your feet. Because something that we do have to accept here is that not everyone is that great at thinking on their feet. There are a lot of fantastic people out there who can write all sorts of crazy stuff, but they need some time to do it. I know I definitely fall into that category, which is why, to me personally, I think that a lot of what players complain as railroading is more an example of improperly disguising the fact that the DM is leading the players onwards.
The most important part when it comes to writing a story that you want to tell, as opposed to a story your players will tell you as you work with them, is giving the illusion of free will.
Yep, there it is.
And that's probably the hardest part about DMing on the fly, or just with the intention of your players thinking they're in a world they're going to be shaping a lot more than they think they are.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
It definitely does. And we'll get into a bit more on that. I'm going to say that's more of the second path, which is controlling the controlling path more. I'd say we should start just going through the improvising path, because that's something that's a little more. Well, I don't know whether you're a bit more fresh with it, but it's something that I definitely have a bit less to say. I want to sort of back end a lot more of the stronger type stuff here. So I just kind of want to get this out of the way because, as I said, this is not my area of strength, but it is something that I've studied and looked over and played in enough sessions that I do have some general suggestions about it. Maybe, I don't know about you, Owlbear. Would you say you're more of the improvising, spontaneous type, or more the...
I think I'm much more of the on-the-fly DMing, and then come back to it after and take notes after the session is finished to just kind of make my own summarization. But for the most part, most of my prepping time goes into maps and encounters and NPCs, but not so much scripted dialogue. Yeah. Like, I'll allow the players to kind of wander and talk to who they want, and I'll make up NPCs as needed that aren't already existing.
Well, I mean, I'll be honest. In general, I think that it's actually a terrible idea to get too hard into the scripting of NPCs, just because it just makes it much harder to organically play them out. Unless it's an interaction between two NPCs, then you can do whatever the hell you want. But when NPCs are interacting with players, too much scripting is not a good idea. With that in mind, since it sounds like you'll be much better for this one, I'm going to go over kind of what I know about this, and you can confirm or deny on this. So, in my experience, if you're going to go through the route of letting your players guide the story, I'd say the first thing you're going to have to keep in mind here is that your story is going to have to be subtle. You cannot make a story, in my opinion at least, that is a very aggressive, time-based, very much, villains are at the player's heels every second. If you want the players to be having their own little adventure and making up their stuff as they go, because that's just going to run counter to, that fun in some ways. In general, it might be a bit better to make the story as more of a background thing. My favorite way to look at this, because I do incorporate some of this into my story, if the players do want to have their own adventure for a while, is and this is actually a really nice little tip that I will give people in general, is when you make your villains in general, give them their own little quest lines, I'd call it. I mean, they should have their own objectives anyways, but have them play out their own stuff in the background. If the players are taking, an in-game month to do this crazy side quest that they've come up with, your villain shouldn't just be sitting around picking his nose. He should be, completing his objectives. He should be doing something.
He should be
anything.
pursuing his ends. He should be
Exactly.
pursuing his plots and plans and schemes and what other
Exactly.
underhanded shenanigans they'd get into.
Yeah, and because of that, even if the players aren't directly going into his stuff too much, they can encounter his stuff as they go. Like if the big bad guy is trying to start a huge war between two countries, the players can just encounter some of his schemes in the just passing as they go by. They can see some of the effects of tension starting to rise between the nations, and in some ways that can eventually attract them back into your story. Much in the same way, if they decide to adopt an NPC, regardless of whether or not whether or not the players pay attention to your story, a clever NPC can pick up on things. So, it's in my opinion, it is good if nobody else will do it. Then at least the NPCs can comment on things like that. I wonder why that's going on over there. Geez, these people sure seem angry and things like that. Just subtle little pushes that can definitely help to suggest the players that this is a direction they might want to consider going. It's not, of course, bulletproof, and it's not guaranteed that they will follow it because they're going to be they're kind of leading your story more than you're writing it. But it's still stuff that can help you get back into a bit more control. What do you think?
I agree with most of what you said. The way I normally try to look at it is when you're writing an open-ended story, or not, maybe not an open-ended story, but when you're writing a story, when you want the players to have a bit more free will, what I recommend is having where your players are starting and where you want the story to end. Like, what is your end goal for the story? And then write as little of the middle as possible, but as your players go about doing their things, you steer them without letting them know that you're steering them. Like, when they're talking to NPCs and they're starting to have their own personal goals, or they're on, basically, to form an overarching story, in my opinion, is just to have many, many, many small arcing stories that start and finish and slowly kind of puts a drop in the bucket towards the finale.
Yeah.
So it builds up over time through dozens of smaller side quests and missions and all kinds of encounters you can run your players through. But it allows them to have the free will and reign to have the fun they want to have, but at the same time, you're slowly pushing them in the right direction to what you want it to be in the long run. So it's kind of playing the long game. You're not there to get them on track and have them pumping out results to push the story, but it's kind of every journey starts with the first step, and each step is a little mini arc.
Yeah, that is a good way to look at it, and I mean, I think some of that stuff is actually going to translate over regardless of whether you're leading the story or the players are leading the story. Things like the fact that it's a bunch of smaller arcs. I think that's a literary constant, no matter what. And when I say literary, I do mean like book writing, because there's a huge amount of overlap between things that happen in writing and things that happen in D&D for obvious reasons. And I'm using D&D as an example here, but it could be anything from Starfinder to Only War to whatever. It's always going to be applicable and relevant things, which is why there's a bunch of fantastic books out there on writing that are fantastic to read. Hero of a Thousand Faces, I think, is a really good one. It's not one I've actually read through entirely myself, but I've heard it's fantastic. Maybe I shouldn't be recommending that if I haven't read it myself. Whatever. But with that in mind, I would like to go into a more like DM-led effort. If unless you have anything you want to add to the end here.
No, I think that was the main thing that I wanted to say on it.
So, I'm going to preface what I'm going to say here with the fact that I have had my perspective on players a bit colored by my experiences with players. I have been running campaigns for a while. I've been running the same campaign for a while. If any DM has been running a campaign for more than several years, they will know exactly what I'm talking about when I say that. To some extent, a DM will not have the best opinion of their players. Players, by their nature, are kind of monkeys. We jokingly said earlier it's like herding cats.
But it's not wrong.
Yeah. So, to that extent, one thing that I have learned, and this is not going to apply to everybody, but it will eventually, in my opinion, it will eventually apply to everyone. It's not something that may at the beginning do it, but you'll get there eventually, is that players don't know what they want. This is the sad truth. In life, most people do not know what they want. So as DM, it is your job to tell them what they want. It sounds rude, but that's the unfortunate truth of it. I have had situations before where I have had the players all gather together, complete one small objective, then sit around and say, "Wait, why are we still adventuring?" And then just kind of literally break off in the one of the very few player-led TPK, total party kill situations I've ever seen, where all the adventurers just kind of said, just like flew up their arms and said, "Well, we're going to go off and raise families now. See ya." Halfway through the story. So after that, I learned, well, sometimes you have to do a certain amount of hand-holding. So there are several tools you're going to have at your disposal if you are leading the story and you're keeping those boys and girls on track. And that the first of your tools is going to be the Helper DM PC. A lot of people are going to hate this one. This is a character that plays like a player character, a PC, but he's made and run by the DM. What's the difference between this and every other NPC? Because technically every NPC is run by the DM. The difference is going to be this is going to be a character, like a central character in the story. This is going to be a member of the party. Do not, I'm going to preface this, and we've talked about this before, do not make this character outshine your players in your party. Do not. If he has a very useful role, their useful role is not something that all the other players are doing. If your players lack a healer, he's the healer. If your players need someone to manage the resources, he's a hired hand and a merchant or something like that. But do not, if there is a wizard, do not make him a better wizard. It's just not a good idea. It makes everyone a little testy with you, since at the end of the day you have the supreme power. You have an experience with that type of stuff, Owlbear?
I've never run a DNPC because I feel like it's double dipping in a sense that like your responsibility as the DM means you should DM, and then there's the responsibility of the players to be players. And if you want to be a player in your own game, I'm not saying you shouldn't, but I don't subscribe to that narrative. Like if the players feel like they need to get somebody, they can just grab a hireling, and that's the closest I'd get to a DNPC would be if they get a hireling. That's just gonna be the NPC in the party that they deal with more regularly than anyone else. Or if it's like somebody like an NPC that they're traveling with for specific reasons, then I'm just gonna be using that player or that NPC to communicate with the players. But I won't like pop one in conveniently to make it seem like I just want to kind of be a player and hold their hands. Because if the players aren't struggling, then the story isn't progressing.
That's fair. And I will definitely give you a bit that it does. A lot of people will see it as double dipping, which is why you have to be very careful about how you play this. I want to note that when I'm talking about a DMPC here, I'm not talking about someone just there for the sake of just being an NPC. Of being like your player in the story, so you get to play too. I specifically refer to a character that's required to basically keep the players on track. I refer to them as a handler NPC, actually. That's my own personal way of viewing them.
Yeah, that's like when you go to the park and you see people that have their kids on a leash and they're all strapped to one of the parents.
Yes.
It's basically like that.
Definitively, yes, and I have done that before, and it works wonders. It just works absolute wonders when you just put them on that little leash. And
I mean that feels too controlling for my taste in DMing. Just because I like if my players just want to go have a couple sessions of shenanigans, I'm not gonna handle them back onto the path.
Well, that's
But
that's
they
fair.
because I try to convey it in the story. I feel like that's more of the thing is handlers are required when the players don't pick up on the story enough. If they don't pick up on the story, or if it's delivered poorly, they won't know what to do, or they'll be unclear of what to do. So they'll start to dilly dally, and they'll start to edge themselves off the path just because they don't know where the path is. So I think it's a mixture between player DM communication and enough interest in this in what they have to do to make them want to do it.
That's that's a fair way to say it, but I'm going to also point out this is a difference in view. This is a difference in perspective on handling this particular issue.
Yeah,
As we established before, you're definitely more into the sort of free form of let the players.
the libertarian DM, people do what they
Yes.
want, and I'll manage them from my position in the sky.
Whereas I am the more fascist DM of I swear to God, you will go this way.
I swear to
I
myself.
swear to myself, if you do not go over there, the beating stick is coming out. And this is, I guess, this could also be from our different experiences. This could also be from the fact that my players are a lot less adept at giving themselves stuff to do. Let's say, because the decision to bring in that sort of handler was not something that I came to easily. This was after I think 3 years of this, and this was after the players very clearly and repeatedly showed their lack of ability to sort of manage themselves. And I, of course, talked out of character with them as well. It's something that you need to each person's going to have to decide. Each DM's going to have to decide for themselves. Not something that you should just bring out and force on the players.
It's not a position I think that you should start at
Definitely
because
not.
that'll kind of show a trust issue between you and the players. But if the players have shown repeatedly, um, I don't want to say an inability, but a preference for the DM to be the narrator and to be the one that kind of like you're basically you're operating a slide projector and they're in the
The
audience.
players need to be spoon fed sometimes. That's I
That's
think
true.
what it is.
I completely agree. I think
Um,
every DM that's ever DM'd for more than I'd say a few months will realize that
yeah,
sometimes what clicks for you will not click for everyone.
yeah. And one thing I'm realizing when I think about it is it could also be the fact that these are players who coming over, like quite a few of them are coming over from like video games and stuff like that, and are not used to that level of freedom and don't know what to do with that level of freedom.
I feel like that's more of a for new people getting into D&D.
Yeah,
So if you were playing, I'd even say a decade ago, that wasn't as much of a problem. But
yeah,
with the way video games have kind of entered the culture, and then younger people in their mid 20s or teens are just getting into D&D now, myself included. The instant gratification that you're so used to in video games you've been playing all your life can really hinder a player's ability to feel immersed because they're not instantly like it's not as fast paced because it's a slow drawn out story. It's not like you're playing a video game where you run through a dungeon in 10 minutes and then you get your loot and then you leave.
of course.
Like a dungeon can take days and days,
Yeah.
IRL or in game.
So going back, but before we kind of went off, I want to kind of sort of go a bit more into this because we kind of went off a little bit there. It for leading your players for leading the players and being the one who controls the story. The other really key thing that I would say is you've got to immerse your players in the story. So what I mean by that is a sort of lighter let the players decide perspective. The story can be something in the background. The story can have implications far off in the distance. But if you're leading the story is all around them. The story is like
They are the story.
more so they are characters in the story. So what I mean by that is rather than there is a bunch of stuff happening in the distance, it can be if it's a wartime thing, the war is happening right here, right now. Like you put players in positions where they have options, but there's a very big looming pressure. We talked before, we mentioned before the idea of time limits. It's not the best way to do it. A much better way, in my opinion, to do it is to lead players by their emotions, so to speak, which is to say, if you get a villain that the players really don't like, you have gotten a golden goose. Because you can position a lot of stuff and the players will lead themselves along that stuff. If you have a single mention of that one person that the players are just have an absolute blood feud with, they'll just run straight forward. So it kind of writes itself. I can hear you have something to say.
I mean, I feel like those are such rare occasions, at least from my experience and from what I've seen, of people just going ballistic in passion towards certain big bad evil guys,
It's
or
not easy to make.
specific. Yeah, and it's not something that happens easily. I think what I do, and what I think is a helpful thing to do, is with your players, talk about expectations before the game starts, and then keep that in mind. And then every few sessions or after sessions, asking your players what they thought about things and what their speculations are, because half the time what you have planned and what you wanted to do will be completely different from expectations and theories from players.
Yeah.
And when you mix those two together, you'll get what you want, hopefully, and the player will be like, "Yeah, I was right. That's exactly what was going to happen, and I was close." So they feel like they were right, and that the feeling of being right and in the positive
Yeah, in the
about
know.
it, yeah, will really get players' teeth sunk into it, because they're like, "Okay, I know what's going on. I'm in the know. I'm rocking it. Let's keep pushing forward."
Exactly. At the end of the day, really, regardless of which way you go, whether you're pushing the plot or the players are pushing the plot, the truth is that you're going to probably bounce between the two. As you become more and more experienced, regardless of which way you started, you're going to have to switch between them. Sometimes the players will be leading the game for a while. Sometimes you'll be leading the game for a while. It's not good to, of course, lean in too hard on any one style unless that's all your players want to do. So mixing things up will definitely keep things interesting. As a good DM, just remember that you're going to have to communicate, as I always say, as we always say in general, you're going to have to communicate with your players. You're going to have to understand what your players need and want, and you're also going to have to understand what you want. It's a balancing act that's going to keep going no matter what. Players will want to do what they want to do, and you want to tell a story, right?
Yeah.
It's going to be something that will not come easy. It will take a bit of experience, but as long as you keep in mind that there's always a compromise at play, and that you always need to figure out some way of bouncing between those two, you'll do a lot better as long as you're keeping those things in mind when you're writing. You'll be fine. To be honest, it's a good thing that all DMs I think will have to constantly deal with. I don't know about.
There's going to be constant compromise, whether a DM likes it or not. And if you can't compromise with your players, you're not going to have players.
Exactly. And of course,
I think that's a big thing.
yeah. Well, that's the balance, of course, is if your players are always needlessly offensive to you as the DM, they're not going to have a DM. Whereas if you're constantly abusive and unpleasant to your players, well, you're not going to have players. And so that's the compromise, really.
It's a symbiotic relationship. The DM needs the players to DM, and the players need the DM to DM.
Exactly. I think that generally covers it. As I said before, this is something we've covered a lot in other videos. It's not something I'd like to, I don't want to rehash old ground too much. And I think we've gotten a good distance on this. Anything else you want to kind of add here?
I feel like that's about it. I think it's very much players and DMs need to talk more out of the game on expectations, and I feel like that would help a lot of games not fizzle out if there was that discussion. Because otherwise, the DM's in the dark of what the players want, and the players get frustrated because they're playing a game that they don't want to be in because it's not what they expected or wanted.
Yeah.
So there has to be a compromise made off the table before, during, and after a campaign for any future play, current play, or past play. I feel like that's what it is. I think it's just that line of communication needs to be more open, and I feel like that's probably the leading cause of games fizzling out apart from schedules is definitely lack of communication.
Yeah, and just to kind of double down on the original question, the best way to balance between that freedom that you want to have, that the players want, and the control you need, is going to be that you kind of are going to go back and forth on it. You're going to watch what the players are going to do and play onto that a lot. But if you want to bring out more of your stuff, it's easier if you move with their flow rather than against it. Always remember that when you're putting this together, you are going to have to make some compromises on what you want, but that doesn't mean you are entirely a slave to their whims.
Yeah, the players will also have to compromise with you. There's no if, ands, or ors about it. There's going to be compromise on both sides, but there's always a healthy compromise that can be made at the table, because at the end of the day, you both want to play D&D, or all parties want to play D&D. It's just a matter of dotting I's and crossing T's.
Exactly. So with that in mind, I'm going to call it here. Thank you for listening to this. This has been your host, Hydra.
I have been Owlbear.
Yep. So if you enjoyed this, the general like and subscribe. We don't bring them out all that often here, as people may have noticed. A lot more of our activity is going to be happening on the Discord. If you want to join any of our games, many of which are might be a little bit too risque to just put onto the YouTube channel, then feel free to come over. I very often will be running different games, mainly this homebrew that I've been throwing together called GOPD. It's a lot of fun, and I'd be happy to see you. You can find a link to the Discord in the description, and I hope you had a great time. If you have any other questions or anything you want us to cover in the future, and you don't feel like going onto the Discord, just leave us a comment, and I'll get back on that. So, with that in mind, I'd like to thank you once again for watching, and have a good night.